little tiny something about me, and it won't be a surprise. I think most can relate to this or appreciate. Each day, when we get up in the morning, Bonnie and I usually end up going different directions throughout the day. So when we catch up with each other later in the day, I've been doing things for church here or there. Bonnie's been at work, at school. We usually try to stop a little bit and ask each other, well, how was your day? How was your day today? Just a little tiny check-in. Perhaps there's someone that you check in with every day, or at least very, very regularly you can relate. Now, when Bonnie and I check in with each other every day, answers will vary. Some days, they're good days. It was great. The kids were on. This was a good day. I got a lot done. I crossed out those statistic reports. Ooh, good. It was a good day. Sometimes it's kind of a ho-hum day. Sometimes it's a tough day. Oh my goodness, the kids were out of their minds today. The moon or something was going on, or I got stuck on the computer and I couldn't figure it out. I got 13 calls and never got to my to-do list. And you can probably all relate. We all have those kind of days all over the place. Checking in on Jesus now in Mark chapter 5. If you have been reading ahead or just you're familiar with this section here, Jesus has been having a very, very busy day. The kind of day that may cause some to think, I could never do that. I could never keep up with all that is going on here. My goodness. It seems that Jesus and the disciples got off a boat in the morning after a very difficult night. That's how it all started. You read about that in the end of chapter 4. They were in a boat during the night, and a big storm came up. A storm that was so big that the disciples, and some of them were fishermen, they were used to being in boats. Some of them, they were afraid they were going to sink and they were going to drown. Meanwhile, Jesus is asleep. And so they run to him, they wake him up, and he calmed the storm. It was a little bit of a harrowing night. You know, you wake up in the morning, how'd you sleep last night? Those disciples, they weren't sleeping at all. They were scared. They got off the boat on one side of the lake, which was the Sea of Galilee, and then they had quite a morning. Chapter 5 begins, Jesus encountered a man possessed. Now that's hardly new. We've already seen some stories in the Gospel of Mark, how Jesus cast out evil spirits. He cast out different evil spirits here and there. So many, we don't even know how many. But this one here is different, because till it's all said and done, Jesus casts out not an evil spirit, but a host of evil spirits out of one man. The demon, when Jesus addressed it, said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He cast out a whole bunch out of this one guy, and when he does so, the demons, the evil spirits, went into a herd of pigs, which promptly ran into the sea and drowned themselves. It was quite a story. The disciples were afraid in the middle of the night. The whole area was afraid for what Jesus did in the morning. Things were really, really stirred up. Then, to get away from that for a little bit of space, they hop in the boat again. How many of you would have wanted to hop in that boat after that morning, after that night? But Jesus said, we're going. They hop in the boat again to cross over the sea, to kind of get away a little bit, just get a little bit of space. But, boy, it's getting to be a long day. And here's where we pick up the story that you're going to see. They get to the other side. No rest for the weary. So you'll have it on the screen, but if you want to open up your Bible, pick up the Pew Bible and follow along. We're in Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. It's a little bit of a longer reading, so maybe if you want to read along with, or just sit back, close your eyes, and picture this story unfolding as the Scripture describes it. Mark chapter 5, beginning at verse 21. When Jesus had again crossed over by boat to the other side of the lake, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the lake. Then one of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He pleaded earnestly with him, "My little daughter is dying. Please come and put your hands on her so that she will be healed and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" You see the people crowding against you, his disciples answered, and yet you can ask, "Who touched me?" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet, and trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." While Jesus was still speaking, some people came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead," they said. "Why bother the teacher anymore?" Overhearing what they said, Jesus told him, "Don't be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw a commotion, with people crying and wailing loudly. He went in and said to them, "Why all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep." But they laughed at him. After he put them out, he took the child's father and mother and the disciples who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl stood up and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. At this they were completely astonished. He gave strict orders not to let anyone know about this, and told them to give her something to eat. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Oh, wow, right? Wow. How does he do all that? How does he do this, and then this, and then this? How does he do this and that at the same time? I confess, as I've been sitting here with this passage for the past week or so, there's an image that keeps popping up in my mind alongside the text. You know Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, I suppose. There's the character of the white rabbit who runs around in and out of the storyline exclaiming, I'm late for a very important date." Something like that, over and over again. He's constantly running around like a chicken with his head cut off, flattling on about time. Not unlike the way some of us may act and feel from time to time. Looking at all that Jesus is up to, we might wonder, how is Jesus not completely flustered by everything that is going on? And more importantly, how might I ever follow his example? I mean, here at the end of a busy day, really night and day already, Jesus walks into what will be his greatest miracle so far. Started out some kind of healing. We've seen that. He's done healing before. It started out some kind of healing, and it turned into Jesus raises a girl from the dead. Here's the funny part to me. He says, don't tell anybody. Like, that story's not going to get out. He raised a girl from the dead. And in the middle of that, there is this inexplicable healing of a woman who had been suffering from a bleeding condition for 12 years. Both of these events are, well, miraculous in their own right and can stand alone with so much to say. Jesus has already healed fever and paralysis. When he did that, and remember, he forgave sins along the way. He's cured a leper, and there are so many other healings that he has performed. We know only generally about them. We don't know what they all were or how many they were. Jesus has proved that he has power over sickness. He has power to heal and to restore. But here now, Jesus shows he has power over life, over death. We should not underestimate the magnitude of this act. You add in the middle of that this healing that just happened, makes us wonder, is there any limit to Jesus' ability? The real wonder, though, I think, is that this woman, unclean by standards of the law, was not rebuked or turned away for her boldness. She was accepted and she was affirmed by Jesus. That might fly under our radar, but that is some really, really good news for all of us. You can come to Jesus just as you are. It doesn't matter where you've been, what you've done. Everyone can come. He doesn't turn them away. He accepts and he affirms it. Here today, as remarkable as all that is, I'm more interested in how do we hold these two acts together? Individually, they're amazing, astounding, but how do we hold them together, and what does it mean for us? Well, there are many efficiency experts. I like to read some stuff in this area from time to time. It feels like there's always a little bit more to do than I can possibly get done, so can somebody give me some help? You read efficiency experts and people who try to coach people personally, professionally, to be all they can be, to achieve. They will tell you, it's almost unanimous, multitasking is bad. Don't multitask, not a good idea. Do one thing, finish it, and then do what comes next. Sometimes, for some things, that makes sense, doesn't it? You're in school, you're at work, you got 2 reports to write, 2 reports, 3 reports to finish. It's probably a good idea to focus on one, finish it, then move on to the next one, and then move on to the next one. Literally trying to write 2 or 3 reports at the same time. Where's this book? Where's that resource? Where's that? Oh, trying to do that at the same time, back and forth, that's a recipe for bad things to happen. Oh shoot, that paragraph shouldn't have been in that paper, it should have been over here. On the other hand, many households with small kids, how many of you remember a household with small kids, or just kids in general, would grind to a halt if mom did only one thing and then the next? What mother or father, grandparent or guardian doesn't regularly have some wash going while they're cooking dinner and cleaning and at the same time helping a child with homework or a project? I'm sure all of you can relate to that. I was the oldest of 4 children. I'm not sure my mother ever only did one thing at a time unless she was asleep. So there's a tension here. There's a tension that we understand, sort of, in theory. But when it comes down to how can this play out in us spiritually, it's still hard to understand or get how we can do anything like Jesus, let alone multiple things. Dwell on these thoughts, and anxiety grows about following Jesus in an anxious and fractured world. So let's take a breath here. Remember, we are supposed to follow his example. Say it with me. We are supposed to follow Jesus' example. Yes? Really? Really? Does that even help at a moment like this when we see how much Jesus did and how extraordinary it was? Is it even possible that we can follow Jesus' example? Well, in John 14, the last night that Jesus had with his disciples, before he was arrested, tried, crucified, buried, and eventually raised from the dead himself, he told his disciples in John 14:12, "Very truly, I tell you, whoever believes in me will do the works that I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these, because I am going to the Father." Whoa! Greater things than these? Does that mean that you or I might raise a person to life? And what could possibly be greater than that? I don't know what could possibly be greater than that. It might just be that it's you or I, sinful, fallen man or woman, compared to Jesus, the sinless Son of God, doing something that we see Jesus did. That might be what makes it more remarkable than Jesus. I don't know. Maybe. It's hard to imagine greater than what Jesus did. As to the first part of the question, could we possibly do as Jesus? Even miracles. that's God's will for you, then yes, I believe so. If you are following Jesus faithfully and it is God's will to work through you a miracle, even raising the dead, I think it can happen. I think it will happen. With God, all things are possible. I know we're in Mark 5, but if you read ahead here, Mark 9 has a story of Jesus coming off the Mount of Transfiguration. He encounters a man at the bottom of the hill who has a son who's been plagued by an evil spirit, and he's at his wit's end. The disciples are stuck. They can't get anything done to help out. Jesus looks at him and says, "What do you want?" And the man says, "Well, can you do anything?" And Jesus says that all things are possible for the one who believes. Let us understand Jesus going to heal Jairus' daughter that turns into Jesus raising her from the dead is Jesus following God's will. We're talking about how do we follow? This is Jesus following God's will. Somehow that's our example. Now, he said in Mark 1, we've been there already, he said in Mark 1 his purpose was to preach. But really, as we get into the scriptures more and more, that was part of his purpose. Later in John 6:38, Jesus says, "I have come down from heaven, not to do my will, but to do the will of him who sent me." Pretty general, but it leaves open that Jesus' purpose may be more than just preaching. In John 10, where Jesus has been describing how he is the good shepherd, he says in verse 10, "I have come that they, his sheep, may have life and have it to the full." Again, pretty general, but it's not hard to imagine that Jesus helping us to have life to the full might include more than just preaching. If we took the time, I think we could easily see Jesus had a bit of a to-do list that started with preaching, but included much more, all of it, according to God's will. Here in Mark 5, in between preaching, he is following the will of the Father, going to heal and ultimately raise this girl to life. If we are in God's will, like Jesus, then what limits are there for us? Not because of who we are, but because of who God is. Are you following God's will fully and completely? Your big day may still be coming. As to the second part, healing the woman with the issue of blood, this seeming bit of multitasking, I want you to notice something. Jesus doesn't really heal her, does he? Not actively, not the same way that he went and took the girl by the hand, Talitha kum, little girl, I said you get up. She is healed through Jesus because she reached out in faith to Jesus. There's a distinction there, and one that we need to see. Think of it this way. Jesus was the source of her healing because of who and what he was. Because of his basic nature as healer, restorer of life, as giver of life. But the healing came from the woman's action, not Jesus' action. The woman came from her acting in faith toward Jesus. The healing came when she connected with Jesus. Good news, that is there for everyone. But few reach for it the way this woman did. Now here is what this makes me think of. And I would have you think of about yourself. Looking at Jesus, am I living in such a way that people are drawn to God through me? Am I living in such a way that people look at me and think there might be help in this person and would come to me, whether I'm reaching out to them or not? Jesus didn't have to do anything to heal this woman other than be himself. He was, in fact, busy with other things. He had not planned on this healing, but healing came anyway. If we live completely for God, others may see that we are different and just maybe come to us looking for what God can do for them through us. And maybe God works through us for them while we're busy, while we're already doing whatever it is that God has given us to do. Now, don't get a swelled head about this. If this happens, it is God working through us because we're honoring him by intentionally connecting to God as fully as we can. You might argue, hey, you're talking about Jesus. Mark 5, it's Jesus that did these things. It's one thing if he is doing God's will and does miracles, and if he is being himself and miracles happen through him, but us? Nah. Us? Yes, really. Because again, we can do as Jesus did, living by faith. And we are supposed to be different. That difference may make a difference in the life of another. The disciples and so many others demonstrate this in their lives. Think about it. Who was Peter? Who was Peter before he began following Jesus and living for him? Do you think Peter's wife, do you think Peter's kids, do you think Peter's neighbors thought that guy, that smelly fisherman, ever do a miracle? Guess what? He raised a person from the dead. Who was Peter before Jesus? Nobody. But with Jesus, all things are possible. Who was James or John or any of the original disciples? Who was Paul before Jesus, before a life transformed? What sets these and so many others apart is that they responded to Jesus. They followed Jesus. They lived for Jesus, and God used them. Why not you or I? What it boils down to is that all of this that we see with Jesus that looks so overwhelming is the natural result of living by faith fully. His life was completely by faith in the Father. All that we see him do was the natural result of him living by faith fully. I titled this message, you look at the bulletin music, it says the word timing there. I titled this message a couple of days ago, Timing, because I had a bit of a different direction in mind when I was planning. I was thinking about things like how being in the right place at the right time could be important for us, and to recognize that don't miss the opportunity, that kind of thing there. But you know what? Any place can be the right time if we're living by faith. A day or so after that, the bulletin's already printed. I might have called this message today, How can we possibly do as Jesus did? And I can't really explain how yet. I can only tell you what the Scripture says, that it is so that we can do as Jesus did. But here today, let's call this message, It's Time. Brothers and sisters, it's time. With the takeaway, it's time for us to live fully the life that God intends for us. Not to live vicariously through some Bible character. Real people, but not to live through them, but to live our life fully by faith for God, the way he intended us. It's time for us to live in such a way that God is recognized, not just in what we do on those rare occasions when somebody sees us do something good, but God is recognized in us for who we are at all times. It's time for us to realize and to embrace that the life we see in Jesus and other greats of faith live, it's not too difficult and it's not too hard for us. Rather, what we see and marvel at is simply the result of living totally for God, totally surrendered to Jesus. It's natural and normal and achievable for all who believe. It really is time. It's time to live transformed by Jesus in every aspect of our lives. It's time for us to live out God's purpose fully and trust that God has something in mind for you, maybe more than you or anyone else can imagine. It's time. You don't have to worry about the pace, about keeping up with anyone. You're never late. It's never too much when you're on God's schedule. It's time. I don't know that any of us will ever raise anyone from the dead, but I do know living by faith, following God's will, makes possible the extraordinary, the unimaginable through us. Yes, even through us.